Cheers.
Cheers, guys. Hannah Brown did the champagne cocktails for us today, and Torey Tran continue with the class. We were so happy to have you today, and like, let's celebrate the end of the year with some bubbles as it's supposed to be. So why food it's not the right glass for the champagne? And what's the right glass for champagne? And why some people complain if you give them champagne in a coupe? Like, just tell us everything about the glassware.
There's always that, Goldilocks moment of, well, I want it in this glass or I want it in that glass. It is subjective. It is a matter of taste. I prefer glassware that is a bit more open, that it leaves a little more room for play and to aerate. When it comes to champagne flutes, I don't know why they still make them. They're narrow. They shroud and diminish what you're smelling and tasting. They came into popularity in the 50s to replace the coupes because it's very easy to spill wine in a coupe. In a flute, not so much. Nowadays, the quality of champagne and the sense of place is so apparent. I really want to smell that. I really want to taste that. And the champagne flute, as traditional as it is, doesn't really allow for that. So something like this, any traditional wine like you would for a red or a white, is much more appropriate in my opinion for most champagnes.
Cool. Very cool. So, chip ties in champagne cocktail or not?
I would say no. Maybe not traditional. Like ice is very readily available in modern America, but most people and most places don't really like ice in their cocktails very much. And this being one of the oldest cocktails in the world, I highly doubt they ever used ice. Yeah.
So at the end, all our classes are gonna connect and naturally kind of work in synergy, because like if you check Philip Duff's class, he's taking a lot about the history of cocktails and actually cocktail as a style in a cocktail world, and like how the ice was implemented. And then like also like we went through like progress of like apples, kind of like through the spirits, and this was the progress about the champagne. We served some like still red wine with Pinot Meunier, right? Yes. Which is one of 3 grapes that can be used in a champagne legally. And with all the other patent classes, everything will kind of just work as a synergy. So cheers to knowledge.
Cheers.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm going to be the head bartender for Patent Pending's newest concept, Agency of Record. Today we're making a champagne cocktail to kick off our champagne class. This is one of the oldest cocktails in the world, at least that's on record. It came around the time of the invention of the favorite of all bartenders, Angostura bitters, around the early to mid 1800s. Using this and the raw natural cane sugar that was available back at the day was a champagne cocktail. It's a really simple cocktail. It's more the ritual of the cocktail that really makes it special. You're taking that really raw, natural, big sugar cube and soaking it in Angostura. This is the bottle it comes in that they would normally be using, but in the modern day in cocktail bars, we use these dashers to make measuring a little bit more accurate. I like mine pretty bitter, so we're gonna go 4, 5, maybe even 6 dashes, depending on what you like. Usually, this is a longer process. It's almost a little bit of a ceremony. It's a very, very simple cocktail using only 3 ingredients, but the more time you put into it, the better it's gonna be. You really want the bitters to be able to soak up in those cubes. You can take a muddler to speed things up if you want. And then very simply, it'll be topped with champagne. Back in the early days of this cocktail, which would be around early to mid 1800s, they would even put a splash of cognac in there. And that's kind of what they would drink for breakfast. Maybe that's where we get the mimosa, we don't really know. But champagne for breakfast has kind of always been the vibe. English people got it from the French, and during the construction of the Panama Canal, this is what they drank for breakfast, along with cigars and black coffee. Very, very healthy people. See if this works. Close enough. Again, a very slow process. We're just going to do a little bit. Help it all come together. You really want to start dissolving those pieces of sugar. These are really big granulated pieces of sugar that are pretty accurate to what they would have had available to them at the time. And let that dissolve for a little bit. And just add slowly, piece by piece. You can already see all these bubbles coming off of that sugar cube, and that's kind of what keeps the cocktail continuing to dissolve and be vibrant and delicious as you're drinking it. You really want to see that beautiful stream of bubbles coming up. Traditionally, we'd get a big chunk of lemon, and we are going to be super classic and put a nice little pigtail on there.
Hey guys, welcome to Patent Quest about champagne. If there's bubbles, no troubles is the official name. Thank you for coming. I want to thank you to a few people. Actually, thank you. Thanks to Ryan McKenzie for making this happen. And also thanks to our editors and video guys, Raul and Angie. Today, I'm honored to present you Torey Tran. He's level 2 sommelier certified by all the sommelier courts, and he's gonna talk about champagne, how to present champagne, history of it, how to serve it, and then at the end of the class you're gonna savor it. So hope you're gonna enjoy. Also, we can start and do cheers with champagne cocktail that our head bartender Hannah Brown at the Agency of Records did for us. She was our special guest for tonight. Cheers to everybody. Cheers. Banging. All right, Torey.
Hello. Thank you, Nikola. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, folks, for coming out to talk about champagne. It's a wonderful category. It's a wonderful place. And today we're doing a deep dive on how those things converge, how those things come together that has helped shape the beverage that we know today. There's about 1,500 years of history here to cover. So strap in, we'll be ready to go. Like any important wine region in France and really the world, to understand what champagne is, we have to understand where it is. Champagne as a region, it exists, you can go there, is about an hour and a half, depending on how fast you drive, an hour northeast of Paris, which geographically puts it in a remarkably cold place. Parallel-wise, I mean, you're dealing with the only other wine region really that makes wines on a global scale would be Germany. But it doesn't have that continental influence of rivers to help things warm up. It's pretty cold. And as a result, it's reflected in the wines. Champagne was kind of dealt a difficult hand. You constantly, every vintage, have grapes that aren't as ripe. They don't get as much exposure to the sun. The process of phenolic development is much longer and extended. And the result is a wine that historically is very bright and light. If you're making a still wine circa 600 AD, it's almost ethereal. It has this vibrancy to it. When it comes to wines like that, I have one today. It's a Coteau Champenois. It is a wine from Champagne, but it's not champagne wine. It is still. And it's as if we were drinking wine stylistically back in the 6th century. It's very light and bright. This particular bottle is 100% Pinot Meunier. 60-year-old vines, just super, almost effortless. Pinot Meunier is one of the 3 noble grape varietals used for Champagne. The other 2 being Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Pinot Meunier adds a bit of complexity. It's notorious for its brightness and its acidity on the palate. So when you're making a cuvee, okay, my Pinot Noir is certainly ripe, but it may not have the acidity I want to show off in my cuvee, my non-vintage brut. What do I need to do? Add a bit of Pinot Meunier. Viticulture, as we know it, in Champagne started around, like I mentioned, the 6th century. And from there, it was pretty status quo for the next 1,000 years. And this is really where it gets interesting. You know, everyone wants to claim to fame that they invented champagne. They invented sparkling wine. In reality, someone out there accidentally made sparkling wine at some point. And there are a lot of limiting factors that have prevented them from making champagne at a larger scale. Physically, the quality of glass was not quite there yet. Coal-fired glass making didn't really hit Britain until the 1600s. And that strength of glass really put them in a better position to make sparkling wine. France, it was still wood-fired. It wasn't quite there yet. Inevitably, though, a vintner might do a single fermentation wine with the intent of making a still wine. He ferments it. He forgets about it in the cellar. Fermentation stops because naturally after harvest, winter comes, and the wine sits for a bit and it just hangs out. When spring comes around and temperatures rise again, the possibility of fermentation starting up in that bottle occurred. And when you have a secondary fermentation in a bottle, that's essentially sparkling wine. Your alcohol increases, and as a result, as a byproduct of the alcoholic chemical reaction, you have CO2. And suddenly you have a wine that may be, they didn't know what it was, right? Is it a flaw in the wine? Now that they're sparkling, there's a bit of effervescence to it. What is it? Can we drink it? I don't know what it is. Half my bottles are exploding for this one particular vintage. You know, at the end of the day, this is an accident and I'm losing my bottles. The first instance of like intentional sparkling wine where like, hey, you know, I want to make something has 2 fermentations was actually in Britain. They would take a wine very similar in style to what you're drinking now, this Côte de Champenois. It's very light and bright. Refrigeration efforts were pretty much non-existent. However, you got the bottles across land, sea. By the time it got to you, it may have been a bit tired. And to rejuvenate it and to kind of give it this essentially a defibrillator for wine, the Brits would add a bit of strum, which is essentially a combination of like sugar, essentially raisins, and maybe some already like sturdy wine. This would not only make the wine a little more brightened up and alive, it would start a secondary fermentation because of the sugar, giving it that effervescence. And from there, you know, people really liked to enjoy drinking sparkling wine. It was used to celebrate king's coronations and beyond. And really the modern expression of champagne as we know it from France, from Champagne, started around the 1700s. From there, it's one of those things where the technology got better to make physically stronger glass bottles. Your average pétillant in the early 1600s might be like 1 bar of pressure. So around like 15 PSI. And as bottles got stronger, the fermentation could last a bit longer, that interaction and the pressure could increase, making the bubbles a bit finer. After embracing what we had for the new technology, we were able to export, and champagne really blew up. You know, you're moving into what I could consider like the 3rd wave of champagne. If you're familiar with like the different 1st, 2nd, 3rd waves of coffee, it's a very similar parallel for champagne. In the 5th, 6th century, you're drinking something very similar to this, light. You know, back then, a Burgundy was considered a heavy wine. Chambord-Musigny was considered a heavy wine, and this was just as light as it got. Then we move into, okay, what's happening with secondary fermentation? We're adding sugar into it. Bottles are exploding. And then finally, a 3rd wave of, okay, let's export the stuff. Let's regulate it. Let's make it the star that it really is and make champagne known what it is today. Champagne is definitely a behemoth in the wine world. In the 50s, you're dealing with maybe 50 million bottles sold. In the 80s, triple that. And then by the 2000s, I think there was over 300 million bottles sold of champagne. As a comparative, in 2000, Napa Valley, which makes 4% of all of California's wines, but represents like over 30% of their like sales, made about 50 million. 350, 50. Burgundy, it's a little north of 100 million bottles for 2000. But that's what ubiquity looks like. That's what like a global force that champagne is. And at the end of the day, it's just delicious to drink. Moving on to how champagne is really made. It comes down to an initial wine always, a base wine. It's the first fermentation, and it's often where a true cave, a master of the cave, will really embrace a few things, namely blending, both of grape varietals and vintage. Your average non-vintage brew, your introductory into a house style, is a composition. It is a bit of influence from the winemaker and the chef de cave, but it's also an influence of what reserve wines do they have, what are they aging it in, and how long. All of these will impact how the wine is perceived. After that initial cuvee is fermented, we need to put it. We need to start the secondary fermentation, and so we put it. We add the secondary. We add a bit of yeast and a bit of sugar and a bit of wine, and age it on its lees for an enormous amount of time, by minimum 2 years. And that's where a lot of complexity in champagne comes from. Your average Prosecco, like I mentioned, it's about half the atmospheric pressure of a typical bottle of champagne. That additional time on the lees, that interaction with the yeast, will give it dimension, texture, aromatics, and it's really where that patience in the cellar, letting that secondary fermentation happen within the bottle, is really what ties it together. As it's aging, the bottles are reversed upside down. The sediment of that yeast will collect at the neck of the bottle. We don't want to drink that. We want to taste it. We don't want to necessarily drink it. And so at the time the champagne is done aging, there's a bit of disgorgement. And disgorgement is literally taking the neck of the bottle, submerging in a bit of ice cold bath water or frozen ice, and popping the cork off. Because of the pressure within the bottle that's been created, it'll jettison out that frozen sediment of yeast. And what you're left with is a wonderful champagne. They add a bit of dosage, maybe some just a touch of sugar, anywhere from no added sugar to, in some cases, up to 30, if not more, per bottle, depending on the style, depending on the label they want to create. I would say, your typical larger houses will add anywhere from like 15 to 20. Most grower champagnes who have something really chiseled and mineral driven, sometimes next to nothing. It's a bit of salt going on. It's the same kind of reasoning that a chef would add butter or salt to a dish. A chef de cave might add a bit of dosage to round out and make something less acidic and a little more balanced. It just depends on what kind of mood they're in. After dosage, it's bottling. They cork it, they wire it, they label it. Sometimes they let it rest a bit, and it's off to the races. Yeah, and you're enjoying a great bottle of champagne. But there's plenty of different ways to open champagne, and a lot of celebratory ways. Most notably, of course, is savoring. Some Corsican named Napoleon, after victory, was really anxious and really wanted to dive into a bottle of champagne. But instead of opening it in a really traditional manner, he unsheathed his sword, a saber, a traditional weapon for mounted cavalry, and whacked the top of the bottle off. It's ceremony, it's pomp and circumstance. It's a great way to open a bottle of champagne, and we'll do one today.
Woo.
So don't do this at home, but I'm going to do it anyway. There are a lot of things behind the scenes that happened to make sure this is done in a safe manner. Like I mentioned, you're dealing with around 30 PSI. No, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You're dealing around 90 PSI of pressure in your typical bottle of quality champagne. Same amount of air pressure behind, a semi-truck tire, just that it's held by a cork and a wire. So do exercise a bit of safety and caution. Don't point it at anything you don't want destroyed, is the common motto. And in addition to that, it is imperative you use quality glass And champagne, if you use something with a little lesser, more entry-level quality, the pressure may not be as high, and oftentimes the glass isn't as thick and can really direct all that pressure towards the top. But I think the most important component of before you can maybe consider opening a bottle via Saber is temperature. This has been sitting in an ice bath for over an hour. You want it cold. COLD is imperative that it's cold. It just helps focus everything towards the top of the bottle. I also removed any of the packaging towards the neck. You don't want anything in the way as you approach the top of it. Lastly, all glass bottles are made with a mold. So they come together. There are two pieces that come together, and therefore there's a seam. That's what you're targeting. That's what you're going to follow. It's a nice little guide towards the tip of the bottle, and you're going to follow it through. It's important that it's not about force so much as a follow through. I sound like a golf instructor, but the idea is consistency, smoothness, cold temperature, quality glass. I remove the wire, just gets in the way. You can really use anything, anything from a spatula, a sturdy wine glass, or a nice sword. This is a nice bottle because the seam is very subtle, and I found it. There you go. Cheers. Yeah, where'd the glass go? A lot of, this is sharp. I have a nice little scar on my thumb on my wedding day from this. But nonetheless, a lot of the, in fact, all of it, the pressure that jettisons that cork will remove any of the shrapnel of glass, so you're free to pour it. But do take caution, it is sharp. Some Charles Heidsieck Brut, arguably one of the best non-vintage Bruts on the market. Mainly because of its reserve wine. The average age in the reserve wine for this non-vintage brew is 10 years old. And as a result, it's a remarkably dynamic expression and one of the great things that makes champagne great. Sure. There's plenty to go around. So we talked about a little bit of history. We talked about place. And really, that kind of leaves us where champagne's heading today. When you ever talk about quality wine, you usually talk about what the French call terroir. Ultimately, it translates to a sense of place. Is this wine indicative of where it comes from? You know, is it showing you what the climate was like, the influence of soil? Is it adding a bit of minerality? You know, whenever I drink a wine, one, it has to make me hungry, but two, it has to impart a bit of a sense of place. Like, I want to go there. I want to go to Champagne. I don't want any jet lag. I just want to be there and kind of embrace what these wines are all about. But it's interesting because a lot of terroir-driven wines talk about, you know, great wine isn't made in the winery, it's made in the vineyard is often the trope, right? So how can something that's really manipulated, right, really involved in the process? I talked forever about how this single bottle of wine is made. Can that be an example of terroir? Is there anything, is it just shrouded? Or is the process of making champagne terroir in itself? Those are the kind of interesting talking points we're at now. There's a huge emphasis on place. You know, before, you know, house style is imperative. You take a firm handshake producer like Krug, and that is a broad-shouldered expression of champagne. It's very good. You had a bottle? What? Oh, okay. But it is a remarkable style, and it's their signature. You know it from a mile away. So what happens when we inverse that and take what I guess a lot of people consider is a Burgundian approach to winemaking, highlighting a singular plot of grapes. Ceylon was probably the first people to highlight everything 100% Chardonnay from a single vineyard. And shortly after, you have some other visionaries, and the wines are racy, they're driven. And hopefully that kind of pushes, it continues to push Champagne into a remarkable wine of place, of quality, indicative where it came from, and kind of continue that conversation of how can we improve? How can we take the next step forward? Champagne's a lovely category. Obviously, it's been used to celebrate coronations, birthdays, you name it, or I just like drinking it. So some quick tidbits on how to open normally open a bottle of champagne. My floor for a level of service, it doesn't have to be hoity-toity, it doesn't have to be stuffy, but I think there's a standard in like, hey, we have good stuff. I want to show it off to you. It can be real simple. As always, showing off the label to someone who ordered it is paramount, just to confirm that's what they want. Next, you got to get rid of the foil. And the Champenois, the foil's here to protect it from dust and whatnot. And it just looks good, better than that exposed wire on the shelf. The same principles of sabering apply to when opening any sparkling wine. The contents are under pressure. Don't point it at anything you don't want destroyed. I remove the wire because it gets out of hand. If you're dealing with a warmer bottle of champagne, you have to be cognizant of when you pick off the wire and take your thumb off of it because it might slip out. When I'm talking about champagne, I'm talking about sparkling wine that's been sitting out in the sun, maybe a little too long for like an outdoor event. But nonetheless, I grasped the cork, and my goal isn't to pull out the cork so much as to turn the bottle. That's how I like to do it. I feel like I have a little more control when I do that. And I can already feel it coming out. And I'm putting downward pressure on the cork, upward pressure on the bottle. Nice, easy, elegant way of opening it. And then I need a glass. Oh, I'm so glad these are here. I don't know why they make champagne flutes anymore. They look good, but they really mute a lot of the textures and really the, if you don't mind trying it, making sure it's sound, I'm sure it's delicious. Glassware and how things are perceived in wine really come down to temperature and kind of and the glassware you put it in. When it comes to flutes, I'm giving you more. Whether you like it or not. No pressure to drink all of it. When it comes down to how a wine is interpreted and perceived on the palate, it comes down to temperature, and glassware matters. Not so much the quality of glassware. To a degree, I don't want to, thick goblet glass, but you need it to open up. You need air in there. You need to get some volume in there and really open things up. A traditional flute is very narrow. I can't smell anything. It doesn't get any air. It's great for preserving bubbles, and that's about it. I encourage you to try really any sparkling wine in a traditional wine glass. I just have universal ones. I don't need the specific Bordeaux, specific Burgundy, this, that, and the other. I just like a good universal one, kind of Goldilocks, not too big, not too small. The introduction of air into a sparkling wine, especially a good one, will give it more body, more texture, a little more aromatic, and it won't be shy about it, right? I don't want a wine to be shy. I want it to open up. I want it to breathe a bit. God forbid you don't finish a bottle of champagne and you have leftovers for tomorrow. If you ever had the chance, champagne, really good ones, oftentimes don't come alive until that second or third day in the fridge. You're dealing with quality wine, and I think that's something that's easily forgotten when it comes to champagne. That it's a wine, it's quality, and try something different, Also, most places serve champagne very cold. I think that's okay. But personally, if it's a really quality champagne, closer to white wine room temperatures, so around 55 degrees, is personally how I enjoy it. The whole conversation really is just about trying something new, seeing what you like, and diving into champagne a little deeper. Beyond that, I'm trying to capture anything else that I need to cover. I wanted to open the floor to any questions about champagne, wine in general.
I actually have one question, like, how come the food became kind of like a staple, a glassware for champagne, when it's actually, as you just said, like not even appropriate glass for champagne?
It really comes down to just how things look, right? Everything's an illusion, and the rest is champagne. It's about the traditional. Just they wanted something as elegant as the wine was. As far as when it came into place, I'm not entirely sure. Happy to look that up though. Yeah.
Also, can you tell us more about those three like standard grapes for champagne?
Sure.
And percentage of it, and like why it's only one variety used, or like two, or all three?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So obviously the wines today are very naked in color, perceived as a white wine. In Champagne, we have three grapes, notably Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and you've had 100% Pinot Meunier. Those are the three major grapes that are used in Champagne to make champagne. In a series of blending, some people use exclusively Chardonnay in some cuvées, some exclusively Pinot Noir, sometimes just red, and all of these have different categories. So you have a Blanc de Blanc, so 100% Chardonnay if it's on the label. You have a Blanc de Noir. You could use both the Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier grapes, or just one or the other. It all depends stylistically what you're after. I think the Champenois are masters of turning lemons into lemonade. The climate is cold, the weather is horrible. They have the three grapes, and they have 300 pages of regulations. That is why champagne is the way it is, and why it tastes so good. They're very diligent about it, and they've been doing it a long time. I find Chardonnay adds a bit of body and viscosity and minerality to wines. Pinot Noir obviously has that sanguine, that blood, that fruit, and Pinot Meunier is notoriously bright and acidic and light. It's probably one of the lightest wines. I haven't had a Pinot Meunier Côte Champenois in a while, and this is a friendly reminder of why they're really good. But I hope that described the three major grapes for you. Any other questions?
How would you put Prosecco in relation to champagne, especially when it comes to like its origin, its
Mm-hmm.
popularity?
Mm-hmm. So Prosecco is made in Italy from a grape called Glera. It has its historical origins there. Glera is an indigenous grape to Italy, and it kind of fell into the same, not trap, but the same category of winemaking, where it was a mountainous region. It got really cold and humid and wet, not really lending itself to making still wine. So what happens if we make a sparkling wine, and you have the Colfondos of the world, the Frizzantes? Inherently, the process is what makes it different, and of course the grapes and where it's made. But Prosecco is always going to be half the atmospheric pressure, typically, of your typical champagne, and as a result, Prosecco typically doesn't have the depth and complexity that champagne achieves through sitting on its lees for 18 to 36 months, sometimes more. That's usually the difference. It's just champagne I find to be a bit sturdier expression of sparkling wine. Prosecco, light, bright, carefree, kind of that one-note wonder D chord on the guitar.
Could you explain what sitting on leaves means?
Yes.
And then also talk about the difference of how you like basically ferment for sparkling for Prosecco versus champagne?
Yes. So to answer the first question, sitting on the lees, because of the secondary fermentation that occurs within the bottle, you want to capture two things. One, you want to capture the CO2. You want to add effervescence to this bottle in a natural way. But also, as a byproduct of that, we're producing yeast. It's not because we want to drink it, but because we want the yeast to interact with the wine. We want to steep it like you're steeping a tea in the yeast. It sounds weird. It doesn't sound very appetizing, but the result is delicious. You're dealing with notes of brioche and aromatics, complexity that really can't be achieved any other way. So with Prosecco, it doesn't see that aging on the lees. Primary fermentation starts, and they might stop it a bit early. And whenever a distributor orders some Prosecco, they'll start fermentation up again in a tank and maybe add a bit of additional wine or sugar to start the fermentation again, and then bottle that immediately. Whereas you get a lot of tertiary flavors with champagne and that aging on the lees and that texture, whereas Prosecco, it doesn't have that extra layer, right? But in return, you get something that's a bit lighter and brighter on the palate.
And with Prosecco, you're not doing a secondary bottling for.
No. You are starting a secondary fermentation, but it doesn't recur within the bottle. It usually recurs in a nice stainless steel tank. You also don't see like a long-standing history of Prosecco because stainless steel really wasn't invented till the beginning of the 1900s. And you couldn't control temperatures as easily in wooden vats. It's very difficult to regulate what is essentially chemistry.
Maybe like if you can explain us a bit more about like Cremant and maybe like bubbly wine from California.
Of course.
How do you feel about it? How do you see it? How do you see kind of like?
So sparkling wine obviously isn't shoeboxed into just champagne or Northern Italy for Prosecco. The French government have actually released and regulate a whole other category of method champenois sparkling wine. So made in the same style as champagne, but not grown in Champagne. You have some great categories like Cremant d'Alsace, Cremant de Bourgogne. And basically, this is method champenois Cremant of a region. So Bourgogne, Burgundy, Alsace, northeastern France, nice and warm. These are essentially ways to highlight other grape varietals and styles of sparkling wine, but under the quality of the champenois method. Obviously, there's nothing like the real deal. A bottle of champagne at a minimum will set you back $50-$60 on a retail shelf. Cremant de Bourgogne, though, you can find some steals. And if you know where to look, you can find some really, really, as close as champagne it gets right next door. But because we're in a different zip code, you save a remarkable amount of money. There's great examples out there. You can find really racy expressions of Cremant de Bourgogne, 100% Chardonnay, sparkling wine, method champenois for half the price of your average bottle of champagne. And it's just as complex as an introductory level of champagne. Worth seeking out. I love Cremant de Bourgogne. California champagne, they were among other people kind of abusing the champagne name. There was a whole reason that Champagne as a region became a protected product, right? I can only, if I'm a part of the European Union or friends with the European Union, if I can't put champagne on a bottle unless it came directly from Champagne. Same thing for Parmesan Reggiano. Same thing for certain cheeses out of France. These are protected names to preserve the quality, that so a consumer doesn't get confused of, oh, I bought champagne from France, but I also see this bottle of champagne from elsewhere. How come it's half the price? Well, this is not really champagne. In some instances, some people were grandfathered in because they've been making champagne for so long outside of Champagne. You can call it like California champagne. And the method champenois, their quality, but they don't have that je ne sais quoi. They don't have that like signature I look for when I taste champagne, when I look for a drink champagne.
Do the Cremants also use the same 3 grapes?
No. So Cremants, depending where it comes from, will highlight the grapes depending on the region. So in Cremant de Bourgogne, they share 2 of the grapes from Champagne, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. They do very well in cool climates. They're very acidic driven. They do well to minerality, and they do well, obviously, for aging on the lees. Somewhere like some Alsace or Bordeaux, they'll use whatever regional grapes that naturally grow there already. And what grapes can go in your Cremant de Bourgogne or Cremant de Bourgogne are regulated. They have to use certain ones. So depending on what region will depend on what grapes. But oftentimes you'll find Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, if able. That's great stuff. Yeah, was there any other questions? No? Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Torey Tran. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Exciting stuff. Now I can drink. I want to try
Yeah.
this.
So this was the last patent class in this season, and we are like celebrating with some bubbles. So thank you everybody for coming, and maybe you should just come around and have a picture together.